I spent 21 days in a hospital bed fighting to stay alive, and my own son never once walked through that door. Yet just 1 month after I came home, he coldly texted me demanding $50,000 for his lavish wedding. Heartbroken by his cruelty, I transferred him exactly $5 with a memo, "Good luck, son." 2 hours later, my phone exploded with dozens of furious calls, and they had no idea that was only the opening shot of my retribution. I'm deeply grateful to have you here. Drop a comment below, letting me know which city or country you're watching from. Also, please note, this narrative contains fictionalized elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the core message is highly valuable for everyone. The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the smell. That particular combination of antiseptic and recycled air that you never forget once you've breathed it. The second thing I noticed was the sound, a steady rhythmic beeping from somewhere to my left, the kind of sound that means a machine is doing the work your body forgot how to do on its own. The third thing I noticed was the chair beside my bed. It was empty. I blinked at the ceiling for a long moment, trying to piece together where I was and why. My chest felt like someone had stacked concrete blocks on top of it. My throat was raw and dry like sandpaper dragged across the inside of my neck. The fluorescent light above me hummed faintly, casting everything in that flat, colorless glow that hospitals seem to specialize in. "Jack?" A voice came from my right, low and steady and familiar. "Hey, take it easy now. You're okay." I turned my head slowly, and there was Arthur. Arthur Mead, 65 years old, same as me, retired auto mechanic, the kind of man who showed up with a wrench or a casserole dish, depending on what you needed, and never once asked for anything back. He was sitting in the chair on the right side of my bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his old baseball cap turning slowly in his hands. His eyes were red around the edges, like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. "How long?" I asked. My voice came out barely above a whisper, rough and unfamiliar to my own ears. Arthur cleared his throat. 3 days since you came in. You had us scared there for a while, buddy." He paused and reached out, squeezing my forearm with one calloused hand. "Doctor said you're stable now, but they want to keep you a good while longer to make sure." I nodded slowly, absorbing that information, the way you absorb bad news in pieces, because all at once is too much. From somewhere in this corner of the room came a small sound, the soft shuffle of movement. I turned my head and saw a boy sitting cross-legged on the floor near the window, arranging a handful of small toy cars into a careful line along the baseboard. He was around 10 years old, slight, and dark-haired, with the focused, serious expression of a child engaged in very important work. He hadn't looked up. "That's my grandson Leo," Arthur said, his voice softening in a way I hadn't heard before. "His mama passed 2 years ago. It's just the two of us now. I didn't want to leave him alone, so I brought him along. He's been quiet as a mouse the whole time." "Good kid." Leo glanced up, then, as if he'd heard his name, and was simply checking in, then went straight back to his toy cars. I looked back at the chair on the left side of my bed. Still empty. Still perfectly deliberately empty, the blue vinyl cushion untouched, not even pressed down the way it would be if someone had sat there even briefly. "My kids," I started. Arthur pressed his lips together. "I called them both Jack. First night you came in." He stopped turning his hat. "Tyler said he had things to handle. Chloe said she'd try to make it when she could." I closed my eyes for a moment. 65 years on this earth, and those words, "he had things to handle," landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I had built my life with my 2 bare hands. 30 years running a woodworking shop outside of Columbus, Ohio, cutting, sanding, building things that lasted. My late wife Evelyn used to say that a man's hands tell his whole story, and mine told a story of early mornings and sawdust, and never once leaving something half-finished. I had raised 2 children in that story, fed them, clothed them, driven them to school and practice and graduations and every milestone in between. And my son had things to handle. I reached for my phone on the bedside table with a hand that trembled more than I expected. The screen lit up and I scrolled through the notifications slowly. There were 3 messages from Tyler. My heart lifted stupidly, the way a father's heart does even when it knows better, and I opened them. The first one read, "Dad, what's the safe code? I need to get something out of there." The second one sent 6 hours later, "Seriously, Dad, the safe code. It's important." The third one sent the following morning, "Also, where did I leave my hunting jacket last time I was over? Can't find it anywhere." I read all 3 messages twice. Then I set the phone face down on the blanket covering my legs and stared at the water-stained ceiling tile above me. My chest ached, but not from the medical equipment. This was a different kind of ache entirely, the kind that starts somewhere behind your sternum and radiates outward slowly, like a crack spreading through old wood. The hunting jacket. He wanted to know about his hunting jacket. "You need anything?" Arthur asked quietly, watching my face. "No," I said. And then, because Arthur had known me for 31 years and could read me the way most people read large print books, I said, "Yeah, I need a minute." Arthur nodded, stood up, and stretched his back with a quiet groan. As he did, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before he paused. One hand pressed to his sternum, breathing carefully through his nose for just a moment before straightening up. His face tightened briefly, like a man absorbing a small, familiar pain, then relaxed again, as if nothing had happened. "Leo," he said, "let's go find the vending machine. Give Mr. Jack some quiet time." Leo looked up, immediately gathered his toy cars into his jacket pocket with neat, efficient movements and stood up. He glanced at me once before following Arthur toward the door, not a child's curious stare, but something older and more careful, like he was checking to make sure I was all right before he left the room. The door swung shut behind them and I was alone. I turned my head and looked at that empty chair on the left side of my bed. Really looked at it. And I thought about Evelyn, God, how she would have been here. She had never once in 33 years of marriage let me face anything alone. When I'd broken my arm at the shop in 2008, she had spent the night in a hospital chair just like this one, reading to me from a mystery novel she'd grabbed from the gift shop, because she said, "You need something to think about besides that arm, Jack." She had been gone for 4 years now, and she had taken that particular brand of showing up with her. I looked at the phone on my blanket. The safe code. The hunting jacket. Somewhere across town, my son was already making plans that had nothing to do with whether I lived or died. Not once to ask if my heart was still beating. Not once to ask if I was frightened or in pain, or lying awake at 3 a.m, staring at a ceiling tile and wondering if I'd ever walk back into my woodworking shop again. 4 times in 21 days, and every single message was about something that belonged to them. I want you to understand what 21 days looks like from inside a hospital bed, because I don't think most people know until they've lived it. It looks like the same ceiling every morning when you open your eyes. It looks like a rotating cast of nurses whose names you learn because they're the only new faces you see. It looks like the blue vinyl chair beside your bed, sometimes occupied, sometimes not, and the particular weight of knowing exactly which category your own children fall into. Arthur came every single day. He would arrive around 8 a.m, carrying a thermos of coffee for himself and a container of homemade soup that his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had sent along because Arthur had mentioned to her that his friend was in the hospital, and she had responded the way good people respond, by cooking something. He would set the soup on my tray table, lower himself into that chair with a grunt that he tried to disguise as a cough, and say something like, "All right, Jack, what are we watching today?" As if we were 2 old men on a porch instead of 1 sick man in a hospital bed and 1 loyal friend pretending everything was ordinary. Leo came with him every time. The boy had taken a particular interest in the small, dry erase board that the nurses used to write the date and the attending doctor's name, and he had appointed himself its unofficial guardian, carefully erasing and rewriting the information each morning with a concentration that made Arthur and me both smile. On the 5th day, Leo arrived carrying a folded piece of construction paper. He set it on my tray table without a word, gave me one brief, serious nod, and went to take up his position by the whiteboard. I unfolded the paper. It was a crayon drawing of a large yellow sun, with a face grinning broadly, with thick rays shooting out in every direction. Below it, in careful, blocky letters, "Get better, Mr. Jack." I had to look away for a moment, because my eyes had gone embarrassingly wet. I pressed my lips together hard and breathed through my nose until the feeling passed. Then I folded the drawing carefully and asked the day nurse, a cheerful woman named Donna, who had taken it upon herself to check on me more than her rounds required, if she had any tape. She produced a roll from her pocket like a magician, and I taped Leo's sun to the wall directly in my line of sight. It stayed there for all 21 days. Every morning when I opened my eyes, that grinning sun was the first thing I saw. Now let me tell you about the messages. Tyler sent his second one on day 6. I was in the middle of a breathing exercise the respiratory therapist had taught me, working to rebuild the lung capacity that my illness had carved away, when my phone buzzed on the tray table. I picked it up, and for one brief, foolish moment, the kind of moment that hope manufactures against all available evidence, I thought it might be him calling to ask how I was doing. It was a text. It read, "Dad, I need to know where the car title for the Silverado is. I've been looking through your filing cabinet and I can't find it anywhere. It should be in there." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and went back to my breathing exercise. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow and deliberate. My hands were trembling slightly, and not from the illness. He had been going through my filing cabinet. While I was lying in an ICU ward, my son had been going through my filing cabinet at home looking for the title to my truck. Chloe's first message came on day 9. "Dad, hope you're feeling better soon. Also, have you seen my gray cardigan, the nice one with the buttons? I think I left it at your house last Thanksgiving." The gray cardigan, the one with the buttons. I stared at that message for a long time. My daughter had not called, had not driven the 40 minutes from her apartment to sit in the chair that had been empty since the day I arrived. But she had found the time and energy to compose a message inquiring about knitwear. Arthur was there when I read it. He glanced at my face and then looked deliberately out the window, giving me a moment of privacy with my expression. That was one of the things I had always appreciated about Arthur. He knew when to look away. "She asked about a sweater," I said finally, because I needed to say it out loud to someone. Arthur turned back from the window. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I heard," he said quietly. Then he reached into his thermos bag and produced 2 of Mrs. Patterson's oatmeal cookies, setting one on my tray table. "Eat something, Jack." Tyler sent his third message on day 14. "Dad, the Silverado title. Seriously, I need it." I did not respond to any of them. On day 17, the doctors moved me back to a regular room after a week in the ICU following a complication that had sent my temperature spiking and my numbers in a direction that had made the medical staff move with a particular focused urgency that tells you, without anyone saying it directly, that things are not going well. Arthur had been there. He had sat in the hallway outside the ICU because they would only allow one visitor, and he had told them he was my brother, which was not technically true, but was in every way that mattered accurate. Leo had waited on a bench further down the corridor, doing his homework in his notebook, with the same careful concentration he applied to everything. When they moved me back to the regular room on day 17, Arthur walked in behind the gurney with his hat pressed against his chest and his eyes bright in a way that told me he had been genuinely afraid. "Don't do that again," he said roughly, pointing one finger at me in mock severity. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I'll do my best," I told him. He sat down hard in the chair and pressed both hands over his face for a moment. His shoulders shook once briefly, like a man releasing something he had been holding too tightly. Then he dropped his hands, straightened up, and said, "Leo made you another drawing. It's in the bag." This one was of a hospital with a large smiley face on the front of the building and a stick figure in a bed inside giving a thumbs up. It went up on the wall next to the sun. Day 19. I was sitting up in bed that morning, eating the breakfast that had arrived on a tray, scrambled eggs that had seen better days, and orange juice that was doing its best when my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen and my chest clenched hard when I saw Chloe's name. My heart lifted again. I could feel it happen, that embarrassing, involuntary surge of a father's hope. She was calling. She had heard how serious things had gotten, and she was finally— It was a text. "Dad, I still can't find that cardigan. Did you maybe put it somewhere also? Tyler says you've been in the ICU. That sounds scary. Hope you're okay." I read it 3 times. The cardigan. Still the cardigan. I had been in the intensive care unit fighting to hold on to my own life, and my daughter had led her message with a question about a piece of clothing. The "hope you're okay" at the end sat there like an afterthought, like something she had almost forgotten to include. I put the phone down on the tray table very carefully, as if it might break. The orange juice sat untouched. The scrambled eggs went cold. Arthur arrived an hour later. He took one look at my face and didn't ask. He just pulled his chair closer to the bed, opened his thermos and said, "Mrs. Patterson sent potato soup today. The good kind with the bacon in it." "That sounds great," I said, even though I wasn't hungry at all. Leo came in behind him, went directly to the whiteboard, updated the date in his careful block letters, and then settled into his corner with a library book. He read with his knees pulled up to his chest, and his brow furrowed, the picture of absorbed concentration. I watched him for a moment. This 10-year-old boy, who had shown up every single day, without being asked, without being paid, without needing anything from me in return. And then I looked at that empty chair on the left side of my bed, which had not been occupied once in 19 days. While the doctors had been telling Arthur to prepare for the worst, my son had not been sitting in a waiting room somewhere too frightened to come in. He had been going through my filing cabinet. And somewhere in that apartment of his, Chloe was looking for a gray cardigan with buttons. I reached up and straightened the corner of Leo's drawing where it had started to peel away from the wall, pressing the tape back down firmly. Some things I was beginning to understand you hold on to, and some things you finally allow yourself to see clearly. The mail had piled up while I was in the hospital. 21 days worth of envelopes and flyers and bills stacked in a neat tower on my kitchen counter, which told me that someone had been coming into the house, Arthur most likely collecting the mail from the box at the end of the driveway, so it wouldn't signal to the neighborhood that the place was sitting empty. That was the kind of thing Arthur did without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. I spent my first week home moving slowly the way you move when your body has just been through something serious and is still deciding how it feels about the whole experience. I made coffee in the mornings, sat in the workshop for an hour or two, just to be near the smell of sawdust and wood shavings. Evelyn always said that workshop was the place I thought most clearly, and she was right about that, as she was right about most things, and then came back inside and rested. Leo had gone back to staying with a neighbor of Arthur's temporarily, and the house was quiet in a way that felt both familiar and slightly wrong. It was on a Tuesday, 10 days after I came home, that the envelope arrived from Meridian Auto Group. I almost didn't open it right away. It was sitting in the middle of a stack of less interesting mail, a water bill, a flyer from the hardware store, a reminder from my dentist, and the return address didn't register as urgent. But something made me pull it out. Some instinct, the kind you develop over 65 years of paying attention to things that don't quite fit. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter, still in my work jacket, from the brief time I'd spent in the workshop. It was a formal confirmation of vehicle transfer. The document informed me that the ownership of a 2022 Lincoln Navigator, my Lincoln Navigator, the one I had purchased 3 years ago after the best year the woodworking shop had ever had, the one Evelyn had teased me about, because she said it was too fancy for a man who still uses the same coffee mug he's had since 1994, had been successfully transferred from Jack Calloway to Tyler Calloway. The transfer had been processed on the 18th day of my hospitalization. I read that line 3 times. The 18th day. The same day the doctors had moved me back from the ICU. The same day Arthur had walked in with his hat pressed to his chest, and his eyes bright with something he was trying very hard not to show. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I had expected them to shake the way they had in the hospital, but instead I felt something cold and very clear settle over me the way a frost settles over a field at the end of autumn. Quiet. Precise. Covering everything evenly. I picked up the phone and called Meridian Auto Group. The salesman who answered, a young man named Derek, who had a helpful apologetic manner about him, confirmed that yes, the transfer had gone through approximately 6 weeks prior. The documentation had appeared to be in order. There had been a signed power of attorney authorizing Tyler Calloway to act on behalf of Jack Calloway in the matter of the vehicle transfer. The document had included a notary seal. "I'd like a copy of that power of attorney," I said, "the one that was submitted." There was a brief pause. "Of course, Mr. Calloway. I can email that to you right away." "Is everything all right?" "Not entirely," I said, "but thank you, Derek." The document arrived in my email 14 minutes later. I printed it out at the small desk in the corner of my living room, the one Evelyn had picked out at a garage sale and painted white because she said the original brown was aggressively depressing. I set the printed page beside a copy of my actual signature, the one on my driver's license, which I photographed and printed for comparison. They were not the same. My real signature is something I developed over decades of signing contracts and invoices and the occasional birthday card. It leans slightly to the right, the J of Jack connecting directly to the A in a single fluid motion, and the C of Calloway loops back on itself in a particular way that I have never been able to fully replicate intentionally, which is how I know it's genuinely mine. The signature on the power of attorney was a version of my name. It had the general shape of the letters, the approximate proportions. But the J didn't connect to the A. The C of Calloway was a hard-closed loop instead of an open one, and the whole thing had a slightly pressed quality, like someone who was concentrating very hard on copying something, rather than simply writing naturally. He hadn't even been careful about it. It was as if he had assumed I would never come home to check. I sat down at the kitchen table and spent the next hour going through the location history on the family tracking application that I had installed on all our phones 3 years ago after Chloe had gotten a flat tire on the interstate and hadn't been able to reach anyone for 2 hours. The application, one of those Find My Family programs that half of America uses, kept a rolling 30-day history of each device's location. Tyler's phone had been at Meridian Auto Group on the afternoon of the 18th day of my hospitalization, and at 2:47 in the morning of that same day, his phone had been in the parking structure of the hospital where I was lying in the ICU. Not in the waiting room. Not at the front desk asking about my condition. In the parking structure for 11 minutes at 2:47 in the morning. I pressed 2 fingers against my mouth and stared at that timestamp for a long time. My chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with my recovery. I thought about what a man does in a hospital parking structure at 2:47 in the morning when his father is lying in the ICU. I thought about the filing cabinet Tyler had mentioned in his text message. I thought about the power of attorney with the wrong signature. And then I thought about Evelyn, and about this workshop, and about 30 years of building things together. A business, a home, a life, and what it meant that someone had tried to dismantle a piece of it while I was too sick to stop them. The anger came then, but it wasn't the hot, roaring kind. It was something quieter and more durable, like coals that have been burning long enough to not need any more fuel. My jaw tightened. I breathed out slowly through my nose. I stood up from the kitchen table, walked to the workshop, and stood in the empty space where the Lincoln Navigator used to be parked. The concrete floor had a faint rectangular outline where the tires had rested for 3 years, a ghost of the thing that had been taken. I looked at that outline for a moment. Then I went back inside and picked up my phone. I did not dial Tyler's number. I scrolled instead to a contact I had saved years ago, a name I trusted, the way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. "Logan," I said, when he picked up my voice, coming out steadier than I expected. "I need to see you. Something has happened, and I need someone who understands the law to help me figure out what to do about it." Logan Hurst had been my attorney for going on 20 years, a 60-year-old man with a slow, careful manner of speaking that made you feel like every word he chose had been thoroughly considered before it left his mouth. He had drawn up my will, handled the paperwork when I'd bought the second property, adjacent to the workshop, and sat with Evelyn and me when we'd updated our estate documents after her diagnosis. "I can see you Thursday morning," he said, without asking what it was about. That was another thing I appreciated about Logan. He didn't ask unnecessary questions on the phone. "Thursday," I said. "I'll be there." I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the printed power of attorney on the table with its wrong signature and its counterfeit notary seal sitting next to my driver's license, like evidence laid out before a verdict. Some things require a lawyer, not a father, and some things, once you see them clearly, cannot be unseen. There is a particular kind of grief that catches you sideways, not the grief you see coming from a distance, the kind that announces itself and gives you time to brace. The sideways kind arrives as when you think you've already handled enough, when you've just spent 21 days in a hospital bed, when you've just come home to discover that your own son forged your name on a legal document, when you're already carrying more than you thought a man your age should have to carry. And then something else happens, and you realize that life doesn't much care about your current load before it adds to it. 6 weeks after I came home, Arthur Meade had a heart attack. I got the call on a Wednesday morning while I was in the workshop running a piece of white oak through the table saw. The phone buzzed in my chest pocket, and when I saw the name on the screen, Mrs. Patterson, Arthur's neighbor, the woman who had been sending soup and oatmeal cookies to my hospital room for 3 weeks, I felt something drop in my stomach before I even answered. "Jack," she said, and her voice had that particular careful quality that people use when they're trying to hold themselves together for someone else's sake. "It's Arthur. They've taken him to Riverside General. You should come." I was in my truck, the old Silverado, not the Lincoln that Tyler had stolen, and on the highway within 4 minutes. Arthur was in the cardiac care unit when I arrived, hooked up to monitors that beeped with that same rhythm I knew too well from my own recent stay. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him look. Arthur had always been a physically solid man, big hands, broad shoulders, the kind of build that comes from 40 years of honest work rather than a gym membership. But lying in that bed with the hospital gown, and the tubes, and the pale gray color of a man whose heart had just frightened him badly, he looked like something essential had been temporarily removed. I pulled the chair up beside his bed and sat down. It took me a moment to fully process the reversal. I had last sat in a chair like this on the other side of it, the patient side with Arthur in exactly this chair looking at me the way I was now looking at him. The symmetry of it pressed against my chest in a way I hadn't expected. "You look terrible," I told him. Arthur opened one eye. "You're one to talk," he said, his voice thin but still recognizably his. "Sit down. You're making me nervous hovering like that." "I am sitting down." "Then stop looking at me like I'm already gone." He shifted slightly against the pillow, wincing. "They say it was a mild one." The doctor used the word mild about 6 times, I think, to convince himself as much as me. A mild heart attack is still a heart attack, Arthur. Thank you, Jack. That's a very comforting observation. But the corner of his mouth pulled up briefly, the ghost of the expression I'd known for 3 decades. Leo was in the waiting room when I'd passed through, sitting in one of the orange plastic chairs, with his backpack on his lap, doing his homework, with the focused gravity that seemed to be his default setting. He had looked up when I walked past, and something in his expression, not fear exactly, but a careful watchfulness, a child's attempt to read the temperature of a situation, had made my chest tighten. Leo's out in the waiting room, I told Arthur. I know. Arthur's expression shifted, and I watched something move across his face that was harder to read than his usual directness. He was quiet for a moment, not the comfortable quiet of 2 old friends, but the weighted quiet of a man choosing his words. Jack, he said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it properly. Go ahead. He turned his head to look at me directly, and his eyes were clearer than the rest of him looked. Leo doesn't have anyone else. His mama's gone, her family's back in Michigan, and they haven't been in the picture since she passed. I've got a cousin in Arizona who sends a Christmas card every year, and that's the extent of my family. He paused, and I could hear the effort in his breathing. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, I said, and I meant it the way you mean things when you're not yet ready to mean anything else. Jack. His voice was gentle but firm. I'm 65 years old, and I just had a heart attack. Let me say what I need to say. I pressed my lips together and nodded. If something happens to me, he continued, I need to know that boy is going to be all right. I need to know he's got someone. He held my gaze steadily. You and I both know what it means to be left without someone when you needed them most. You just spent 21 days learning it all over again. Don't let that boy learn it for the first time. I looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the Ohio spring was making its tentative muddy appearance, pale green leaves just beginning to show on the trees, the sky a thin, washed-out blue. You're asking me to take him, I said. I'm asking you to be who you already are, Arthur said. There's a difference. Arthur Meade died 9 days later on a quiet Thursday morning, with Leo sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, and me standing at the window, watching the parking lot, because there are moments when a man needs to look somewhere other than the thing that is breaking his heart. The funeral was small. Mrs. Patterson, a few men from the auto shop where Arthur had worked for most of his adult life, Logan, who came because he had known Arthur through me, and because Logan was the kind of man who showed up, and Leo who stood at the graveside in a dark blue sweater that was slightly too big for him and did not cry. Though his chin trembled once in a way that made me have to look at the middle distance again. Afterward, in the parking lot of the cemetery, Logan put a hand on my shoulder and said, I can start the emergency guardianship paperwork today if you want. Given the circumstances, no immediate family, the boy's age, your existing relationship with him, the court should be able to grant temporary guardianship within the week. We can work on the longer-term arrangement from there. Do it, I said. Logan nodded and walked to his car, already pulling out his phone. I walked back to where Leo was standing beside my truck, his backpack over one shoulder, his toy cars in his jacket pocket. I could see the outline of them through the fabric. He was looking at the row of headstones with an expression that was too old for his face. Leo, I said. He looked up. How would you feel about coming to stay with me for a while? I've got a guest room, and I could use someone to help me figure out what that thing in my garden is, because I planted tomatoes in March, and something is definitely growing, but I'm not entirely sure it's tomatoes. Leo stared at me for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile yet, but the thing that comes before one. Arthur said you couldn't grow anything, he said carefully. Arthur was mostly right about most things, I admitted. But I'm willing to try if you are. We drove home in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. Leo sat in the passenger seat with his backpack on his lap, watching the road ahead of us. Halfway home, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out one of his toy cars, turned it over in his hands a few times, and put it back. Just something to hold. Just something solid, when everything else had gone uncertain. At the house, he carried his one bag into the guest room, the room that still had the blue curtains Evelyn had put up years ago because she'd said the morning light in that room was too aggressively cheerful without something to soften it. Leo set his bag on the bed, looked around the room with quiet, methodical attention, and then turned to me in the doorway. "Thank you, Mr. Jack," he said. "Just Jack," I told him. "Or Grandpa Jack, if that's easier. Arthur called me Jack, and he was about the best judge of character I ever knew." Leo considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Grandpa Jack," he said, trying it out. Then he nodded once as if it had passed inspection, and turned back to unpacking his bag with neat, careful movements. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. I thought about Evelyn, who had always wanted more children, and had settled gracefully and without complaint for the two we had. I thought about Arthur, who had known me well enough to ask for exactly the right thing. And I thought about a 10-year-old boy who had shown up at a hospital every single day for 3 weeks and taped a drawing of a grinning sun to a sick old man's wall without being asked. Some people, I was learning, earn their place in your life not by arriving loudly, but by simply refusing to leave. I have never been a man who acts out of anger. Anger is an expensive thing. It costs you clarity, and clarity was the only currency I had left after everything that had happened. So when I walked into Logan's office on that Thursday morning in May, I did not walk in as a wounded father looking for someone to validate his feelings. I walked in as a man with a folder of documents, a clear head, and a very specific set of questions. Logan Hurst's office was exactly what you would expect from a man who had been practicing law for 35 years in the same building, on the same street in Columbus, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that had seen better decades, and the particular organized disorder of someone who knew exactly where everything was and didn't need it to look neat. He stood up when I came in, shook my hand the way he always did, firm, brief, no performance to it, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Talk to me," he said. I laid everything out on his desk. The confirmation letter from Meridian Auto Group, the printed copy of the forged power of attorney beside my actual signature from my driver's license, the screenshots from the Find My Family application showing Tyler's phone at the hospital parking structure at 2:47 in the morning. The text messages Tyler had sent during my 21 days in the hospital, the ones about the safe, the filing cabinet, the truck title. Logan picked up each document carefully, read it thoroughly, and set it down without comment until he had gone through all of them. Then he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me. "This is forgery, Jack," he said, "and fraud. Both are felonies in Ohio. The forged notary seal alone adds a separate charge." He paused. "You understand what filing this means?" "He's my son," I said. "I understand what it means." Logan nodded slowly. "I'll prepare the report for the detective's office today. The investigation will take time, these things always do. But the evidence you have is solid." He picked up the power of attorney one more time. "This signature wouldn't fool anyone who knew your real one." "It wasn't meant to fool anyone who was paying attention," I said. He assumed I wouldn't come home. The room was quiet for a moment. Logan set the document down. "There's something else I want to do," I said. "I want to revoke every financial authorization I've ever given Tyler over the company. Every single one." Logan reached for his legal pad. "Revocation of financial power of attorney. I can have that drawn up and notarized before you leave today. Once it's filed, any loans or financial obligations Tyler has signed in the company's name without current authorization become immediately callable by the bank." He glanced up. Robert Haynes had been the branch director at First Meridian Bank for as long as I had been a customer there. A careful, methodical man of 50 who had the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed spreadsheets. He was the kind of banker who remembered your account details without looking them up and sent a handwritten note when a business loan cleared. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has handled your money honestly for 15 years. I called him from Logan's office that afternoon. "Jack," he said when he heard my voice. "Good to hear from you. How are you feeling?" "Better," I said. "Robert, I need to talk to you about some financial authorizations I'm revoking and about some obligations that may have been signed in my company's name without proper current authority." There was a brief pause. "Come in tomorrow morning," he said. 8 o'clock. I'll pull everything and we'll go through it together. The meeting with Robert the following morning took 2 hours. What emerged from those 2 hours was a picture I hadn't fully known to look for. Tyler had been using a limited financial authorization. I had granted him 4 years ago, back when I had trusted him with certain company accounts, to sign off on personal loan arrangements that used the company's assets as backing collateral. It was not something Robert's team had flagged at the time because the authorization on file had appeared valid. But with that authorization now formally revoked and the forgery report filed, the picture had changed significantly. "I want everything called in that was signed under that authorization," I told Robert. He looked at me steadily across his desk. "Jack, that's going to create serious financial pressure for Tyler very quickly." "Yes," I said, "it is." Robert nodded once and made a note. He was not a man who asked unnecessary questions when a client had clearly already made up his mind. The last thing Logan and I did that week was begin the paperwork for the irrevocable trust. In simple terms, a trust of this kind meant that Jack's assets, the house, the woodworking shop, the second property, the company holdings, would be placed into a legal structure that I would manage during my lifetime, with Leo named as the sole beneficiary upon reaching 18 years of age. Tyler and Chloe would receive nothing because the trust would supersede any prior inheritance assumptions. This was entirely legal. In the state of Ohio, a parent has the absolute right to disinherit adult children, provided it is documented clearly and executed properly. Logan walked me through every page, every clause, every implication. I signed where he told me to sign. My hand was steady throughout. On the drive home, I stopped at a diner and ate a late lunch, a turkey sandwich and a cup of coffee, and sat in the booth for a while watching the people come and go. Regular people having regular afternoons. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for weeks. When I got home, Leo was at the kitchen table working through a spelling worksheet with his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration. He looked up when I came in. "Grandpa Jack," he said, "how do you spell necessary?" "Necessary," I said, hanging up my jacket. "1 collar and 2 socks." Leo stared at me. "What does that mean?" "1 C, 2 S's. It's how my teacher taught me when I was about your age." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Did it help?" He wrote it out carefully on his worksheet, lips moving slightly. Then he looked up with the closest thing to a grin I had seen from him yet. "Yeah," he said. "That actually helped." I picked up the day's mail from the counter and started sorting through it. Tyler would find out soon enough what had been set in motion. He always did find out things, just never the things that mattered, and always too late to change them. Exactly 1 month after I buried my oldest friend, my son sent me a text message asking for $50,000. Not a phone call, not a visit. A text message sent at 6:47 in the evening on a Tuesday, while I was sitting at the kitchen table across from a 10-year-old boy who was working through a page of long division with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something complicated. I want to be precise about the timing, because precision matters here. Arthur had been in the ground for 31 days. I had not received a single message from Tyler during those 31 days asking how I was holding up, or whether Leo had settled in all right, or whether the man who had raised him needed anything at all. 31 days of nothing. And then this. The message read, "Dad, I need $50,000. I'm marrying Victoria in October, and the wedding costs are serious. This is important to me and I need your support. Family helps family. I read it once. Then I set the phone face down on the table and looked at Leo's long division worksheet for a moment, not really seeing it. Family helps family. He had written that. The same son who had spent 21 days texting me about a safe code and a hunting jacket while I lay in a hospital bed, who had forged my signature on a legal document while I was unconscious, who had not sent a single word. When Arthur died, that son had written the words, "Family helps family," and he had meant them to land like an argument I couldn't refute. I had heard about Victoria through my cousin Margaret, who lived 2 streets over from Tyler's apartment, and had mentioned in passing some months back that Tyler had been seeing a young woman who worked at a clothing boutique downtown, and that things seemed to be getting serious. What Margaret had also mentioned, in the careful way she mentioned things she found slightly distasteful, was that Victoria's father, a man named Thomas, who ran a restaurant over on the east side, had made it very clear that any man wanting to marry his daughter would need to demonstrate financial stability. A wedding of the kind Thomas expected did not come cheaply, and Tyler had never been a man who planned ahead for the things that required planning. What I understood sitting at my kitchen table was that Tyler had already committed to expenses he could not cover. His own accounts were significantly constrained from the loan recalls Robert Haynes had processed, and whatever he had promised Victoria and her family required money he did not have access to anymore. He needed the $50,000 from me not because he had planned a wedding within his means. He needed it because he had promised a wedding far beyond them, and the gap between what he had promised and what he actually had was now his most urgent problem. "Grandpa Jack," Leo said from across the table, not looking up from his worksheet. "Are you okay? You've got your thinking face on." I looked at him. This 10-year-old boy doing his homework at my kitchen table, who had noticed the shift in my expression before I'd said a single word, who had asked simply and directly and without any agenda whatsoever whether I was okay. "I'm all right," I said. "I've just got something to work through." Leo nodded, accepting this completely, and went back to his long division. "Okay," he said. "Let me know if you want to talk about it." I picked up the phone. I opened the banking application that I had used for 15 years to manage the shop's accounts and my personal finances. I navigated to the transfer screen and typed in Tyler's account number, which I had memorized the way you memorize things you've used often enough. In the amount field, I typed $5.00. In the memo field, I typed 7 words, "Good luck, son, I mean that." I pressed send. The transfer processed in 4 seconds. Then I put the phone down on the table, right side up this time, and looked across at Leo. "Leo," I said, "what do you want for dinner tonight? I was thinking about making that chili you seemed to like last week." Leo's face brightened immediately, the long division forgotten. "The one with the cornbread?" he asked, hopeful, in the specific, careful way of a child who has learned not to assume things will go his way. "The one with the cornbread," I confirmed. He grinned, then a real one, full and unguarded, the kind that made the whole kitchen feel different. "Yes, please," he said with a formality that I found endearing every single time. I stood up and moved to the stove. Behind me, I could hear Leo going back to his worksheet, the scratch of his pencil resuming its careful work. Outside, the Ohio summer evening was settling in the light, going golden through the kitchen window. The way it did at this hour, the way it always had in this house. The way it had when Evelyn used to stand at this same window and say that she never got tired of it, not once in 30 years. The phone was still on the table. Face up now, screen dark, waiting. I knew it wouldn't stay dark for long. Tyler had never been good at waiting. He had never developed the patience for it, the way you develop patience for things that take time, a business, a marriage, a piece of wood that needs to be worked slowly or it splits. He wanted what he wanted when he wanted it, and $5 sent in reply to a request for $50,000 was not the kind of response a man like Tyler received quietly. I stirred the chili and listened to Leo hum something tuneless under his breath while he worked through his math. And I thought about how strange and clarifying the last few months had been. You spend decades assuming you understand the people closest to you. And then something happens. A hospital bed, an empty chair, a forged signature, and the understanding arrives all at once, complete and irreversible. Outside, the summer evening was very quiet. That wouldn't last either. 2 hours. That is exactly how long it took for my son to call me 17 times. I know the number precisely because I counted them. Each time the phone lit up on the kitchen table, I looked at the screen, watched Tyler's name pulse there for a moment, and set it back down. 1, 2, 3. The chili was done and put away. Leo had been in bed since 8:30, worn out from a full day of school, and an afternoon of helping me pull weeds in the back garden, with the serious dedication he brought to everything. The house was quiet, and my phone kept lighting up in the dark like something that refused to accept the situation. By the 12th call, I had moved to the living room armchair, the old one with the brown fabric that Evelyn had tried to replace 4 separate times, and I had refused to give up because it fit the particular shape of a man who had been sitting in it for 20 years. I sat in the dark with the phone on the armrest and watched it glow. By the 16th call, I had decided I would answer the 17th. Not because I was ready to negotiate. Not because I had anything to apologize for. But because Tyler deserved to say what he needed to say, and I deserved to hear it clearly and completely, so that when I responded, there would be no room for him to claim I hadn't listened. The 17th call came in at 9:52 in the evening. I picked up. For a moment, there was just breathing on the other end, ragged, the kind that comes from a man who has been working himself into a state for 2 hours and is now suddenly confronted with the silence he was trying to fill. Then Tyler's voice came through, and it was loud enough that I held the phone a few inches from my ear. $5, he said. You sent me $5. Do you have any idea how that felt? I asked you for help, Dad. I asked you for one thing, and you sent me $5 like I was some kind of joke to you. I listened. I let him go. He talked about the wedding, about Victoria, about how hard he had been working to build something, and how he just needed one person in his corner for once. His voice cracked twice, once when he mentioned Victoria's name, and once when he said the word father, in a way that was meant to make me feel the weight of it. I noticed both moments and said nothing. When he finally ran out of steam, the line went quiet. Are you done? I asked. My voice came out the way I intended it, to level unhurried, the voice of a man who has been sitting in the dark, thinking for 2 hours, and has had time to decide exactly what he wants to say. Dad, let me speak now, I said. You had your turn. I heard him exhale sharply, then quiet. Tyler. I said, I am going to tell you something, and I need you to hear every word of it. While I was in that hospital bed, while I was in the ICU, while the doctors were having conversations with Arthur about what might happen if things didn't improve, you were in the parking structure of that hospital at 2:47 in the morning. Not in the waiting room. Not at the front desk asking about your father's condition. In the parking structure. And the next afternoon, you were at Meridian Auto Group submitting a power of attorney with my signature on it. A signature that was not mine. The silence on the other end of the line changed quality. It went from the silence of a man catching his breath to something thicker and harder to read. I don't know what you're... Tyler started. Yes, you do, I said quietly. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And so do I. And so does my attorney. I paused to let that land. That $5 is the precise value I am assigning to a request for money from a man who forged his father's name on a legal document while that father was unconscious. Not $1 more, not $1 less. Exactly 5. Tyler's breathing had changed. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier heat and picked up something shakier underneath. Dad, I can explain. Not tonight, I said. Not like this. I ended the call. The phone sat in my hand for a moment, warm from the conversation. Then my screen lit up again, almost immediately, not Tyler this time. Chloe. Her message read, "Dad, what is going on? Tyler called me freaking out. Whatever you think happened, you need to just help him. He's your son. If you don't fix this, I swear we are done. You won't hear from either of us again." I read it once. We are done. You won't hear from either of us again. I thought about 21 days. I thought about a safe code and a gray cardigan and a hunting jacket. I thought about a forged signature and a parking structure at 2:47 in the morning. I thought about an empty chair and a boy who drew a grinning sun in crayon and taped it to a sick man's wall without being asked. And then I blocked Chloe's number. It took 3 seconds. I found her contact, pressed block confirmed. 3 seconds to close a door that she had been slowly walking away from for years without either of us fully saying so. The house was very quiet after that. I sat in Evelyn's chair, my chair, and listened to the particular silence of a house where a child is sleeping and everything is still. Down the hallway, I could hear the faint sound of Leo's ceiling fan, the one he liked running even in cool weather, because he said it helped him think when he was almost asleep. The silence after those 17 calls was different from the silence I had learned in the hospital. That silence had been hollow, the silence of absence and waiting and hoping for something that never came. This silence had a different texture entirely. It had weight and substance and the particular solidity of a decision that has been made and will not be unmade. Tyler knew that I knew. And somewhere in that knowledge, everything between us had shifted in a way that no amount of phone calls could shift back. I put the phone on the side table face down and closed my eyes. There is a particular kind of desperation that makes a man double down on a losing hand. I had seen it before in business, in the occasional difficult negotiation over a contract at the shop, in the way certain people respond to the word no by simply saying their original request louder, as if volume was the variable that had been missing all along. Tyler had always had a talent for it. When he was 12 years old, and I told him he couldn't go to a friend's overnight party because his grades needed attention, he spent the next 4 hours escalating, first asking again, then arguing, then sulking loudly, then finally declaring that I was the worst father in the history of Ohio. I had sent him to his room without responding to any of it, and by morning he had moved on entirely. He was 32 years old now. The tactics had not improved. The message came in at 6:14 in the morning, while I was standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee to finish. Leo was already at the table, systematically working his way through a bowl of cereal with the methodical patience he applied to most things, occasionally reading the back of the cereal box between bites, the way children do when they find themselves momentarily without other material. My phone buzzed once. I looked at the screen. Tyler's message read, "Fine. If that's how you want to play this, I still have the navigator. You want to test me, I'll sell it today. Every dollar goes to the wedding. You can explain to the whole family why you'd rather let your son lose everything than help him for once in your life." I read it standing at the counter with my coffee mug in my hand, the coffee still brewing behind me, filling the kitchen with the particular smell that had started every morning in this house for 30 years. Leo looked up from his cereal box. "Everything okay, Grandpa Jack?" "Fine," I said. "Eat your breakfast." He went back to reading about the nutritional benefits of whole grain oats, apparently satisfied with this answer. I took a long sip of coffee. Then I set the mug down, picked up the phone, and opened the family group chat. A conversation I had not contributed to in nearly 8 months. The chat had 61 members accumulated over decades of Callaway family gatherings. Cousins, aunts, uncles, in-laws of in-laws, people I saw twice a year at Christmas, and once at the occasional summer barbecue. It was the kind of group that mostly trafficked in birthday wishes and forwarded recipes and photographs of grandchildren. I scrolled up briefly, checking the most recent activity. Someone named Patricia, a cousin of mine from the Dayton branch of the family, had shared a photograph of a flower arrangement 2 weeks ago. Before that, Tyler had posted a photograph of himself and Victoria at a restaurant smiling with a caption that read, "Celebrating good things to come." The post had 43 heart reactions. I pressed the camera icon and photographed each of Tyler's messages from my 21 days in the hospital. The safe code requests the filing cabinet, the truck title, the hunting jacket. Chloe's cardigan inquiries laid out flat on the kitchen counter in chronological order. Then I typed a single paragraph. I want the family to have some context for recent events. These are the messages I received from Tyler and Chloe during the 21 days I was hospitalized earlier this year, including the days I spent in the ICU. Regarding the Navigator, the vehicle was taken out of Tyler's name as part of an ongoing legal matter and is no longer his to sell. I wanted everyone to have accurate information. That is all. I pressed send. Then I put the phone face up on the counter and poured myself a second cup of coffee. Leo finished his cereal, rinsed the bowl at the sink the way I had shown him, and came to stand beside me at the counter. He looked at the phone, which had begun vibrating with the particular sustained urgency of a device receiving a large volume of messages in rapid succession. "Your phone is making a lot of noise," he observed. "It is," I agreed. "Is that bad?" I considered this genuinely. "No," I said. "I think it's the sound of people finding out the truth about something. That sound is usually a little noisy at first." Leo processed this with the focused expression he used when he was filing information away for future reference. "Okay," he said. "Then, can I have toast?" "There's bread in the second drawer," I said. He went to find it, and I turned the phone face down on the counter so that the screen was no longer visible. The vibrating continued steadily. For the next several minutes, I could feel it through the countertop, and I stood at the window and drank my coffee and watched the backyard, where the garden was doing its best in the Ohio summer heat, and where the tomatoes I had planted in early spring were, against all reasonable expectation, actually producing tomatoes. Arthur would have found that funny. He had been very certain they would fail. Behind me, the toaster clicked. Leo said, "Grandpa Jack, do we have peanut butter?" And I told him second shelf of the pantry left side, and he said, "Found it," with the quiet satisfaction of a small successful mission accomplished. The phone had gone still by the time I finished my coffee. Not because the conversation had ended, I knew, but because there was only so much anyone could say before they needed to wait and see what happened next. Tyler's threat had been the last card he thought he had. What he didn't know yet, what I had not told him, and would not tell him, was that the card he'd been holding wasn't his anymore. The Navigator had been formally removed from his name by the investigative process Logan had set in motion 2 months ago. Tyler could not sell what he no longer owned. He had made his threat against a position that no longer existed, which was in a way the most Tyler thing he had ever done. I rinsed my coffee mug, left it on the drying rack, and went to the workshop. There was a cabinet I had been meaning to finish for the better part of a month. The wood was white oak, the same as I'd been running through the table saw the morning Mrs. Patterson called about Arthur. It seemed like a good day to return to it. The phone had been quiet for almost 11 hours. I noticed it the way you notice when a storm finally stops, not with relief exactly, but with a kind of cautious stillness, like the air itself is deciding what comes next. After the group chat erupted the night before, after 40-something family members sent messages ranging from confused questions to outright accusations after Tyler's ultimatum sat unanswered, and Chloe's number rang through to voicemail twice before I remembered I had blocked her, the silence that followed felt almost too heavy to trust. I made coffee. I set 2 cups on the counter out of habit, then moved one to the back of the shelf because Leo preferred orange juice in the mornings. That had been Evelyn's habit too, leaving a second cup out. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the shelf and let myself feel that. Leo came downstairs at 7:15 wearing mismatched socks, one blue one with little yellow stars, and asked if we had any of the frozen waffles left. We did. I put 2 in the toaster and told him to grab the syrup from the second cabinet, not the first, because I'd moved it last Tuesday, and he always forgot. He laughed a little at that, the way kids do when adults admit to doing something forgetful, and the sound of it filled the kitchen in a way I hadn't expected to need that morning. My phone lit up at 7:42. It was Robert Haynes, the branch director at First Meridian Bank. I had spoken with Robert twice in the past month, once with Logan present, when we filed the formal revocation of Tyler's financial authority, and once by phone, when Robert confirmed that the bank's legal team had reviewed the forged power of attorney documentation that Logan submitted as part of the fraud report. Robert was a careful man. He did not call without a reason. I stepped out to the back porch while Leo ate his waffles. Robert told me that effective that morning, Tyler's access to any account tied to Callaway Woodworks or the family's joint investment portfolio had been formally suspended. The bank's fraud review unit had cross-referenced the forged power of attorney signature with the original documents on file and found in their words significant inconsistencies. Robert used the phrase significant inconsistencies, the way lawyers use careful language precisely without embellishment, because the facts were already doing the work. Tyler had also, Robert explained, attempted to make a wire transfer the previous evening, $48,000 moving toward an account registered to a wedding venue called Whitmore Estate. The transfer had been flagged automatically by the fraud detection system held for review, and this morning formally denied. The funds never moved. I thanked Robert. I told him I appreciated how thoroughly his team had handled the situation. He said that was what they were there for, and that Logan would receive the official correspondence by end of business day. I sat down on the porch steps after I hung up. There was a tomato plant at the far end of the garden that Arthur had helped me stake up the previous spring before everything happened. It had gotten unruly over the summer branches spreading sideways instead of climbing the way they were supposed to. I had been meaning to trim it back for weeks. I looked at it now in the early morning light and thought that it was still producing despite being a little wild. Small red tomatoes clustered at the tips, doing what it was built to do regardless of the mess around it. Leo knocked on the back door and held up his empty plate. "All done," he said. "Can I take my sketchbook to the porch?" "Bring your juice too," I said. He disappeared and came back 2 minutes later with his sketchbook tucked under one arm and the half-empty glass of orange juice balanced carefully in both hands. He settled on the step beside me and opened to a blank page without saying anything else, and we sat like that together in the quiet morning, him drawing and me watching the tomato plant. I thought about Tyler in that moment. Not with anger, the anger had burned through me weeks ago, slow and thorough, and what was left now was something closer to clarity. I thought about the phone calls Tyler must have made that morning when the wire transfer failed, the account access denied, the notifications that would have come through on his end, each one closing a door he had assumed would always be open. When you borrow authority that was never given to you, the debt comes due differently than a financial one. Money can be repaid. The trust that Tyler had borrowed from me from 32 years of a father working himself raw so his son would never have to worry, that was not something a wire transfer could have settled. Logan had told me when we first sat down and laid out everything on his conference table that the legal process would feel slow. That patience was not optional, it was structural. I had thought I understood what he meant. Sitting on that porch step while Leo sketched quietly beside me, watching the light shift across the garden, I understood it more fully. The phone stayed quiet for the rest of the morning. At 11, I went into the workshop and ran my hand along the white oak cabinet I had been building. The wood was smooth where I had sanded it rough at the unfinished edges. I picked up my hand plane and got back to work. Some things I had learned you simply had to shape one careful pass at a time. That afternoon, Logan called to confirm what Robert had already told me. And then he said something I had been waiting to hear for a long time. "Jack," he said, "the trust documentation is ready for your final review." The email came in at 6:53 in the morning, 3 days after Tyler's wire transfer was denied. I almost missed it. I was in the workshop by 6:30 most days now, partly because the white oak cabinet needed finishing, and partly because the workshop was the one place in the house where the noise of the past few months had not yet followed me. The wood didn't ask questions. The hand plane didn't require explanations. I had the radio on low, a morning talk program I never really listened to, just for the sound of voices in the background, when my phone buzzed on the workbench beside my coffee mug. The sender was an email address I didn't immediately recognize. Then I saw the name in the subject line. "Dad, it's Chloe. Please read this." I set down the hand plane. I had blocked Chloe's phone number 2 weeks ago, the same night I blocked Tyler's, after she sent me that text threatening to cut contact if I didn't help her brother. I hadn't heard from her since. I hadn't looked for a way to. The silence had felt like a natural conclusion to something that had been ending for a long time. She had found my email address, the one I used for Callaway Woodworks orders and supplier invoices, and sent her message there instead. I stood at the workbench in the early morning light and read it twice before I moved. Chloe wrote that she was scared. She wrote that Tyler had borrowed a significant amount of money from people who were not patient about repayment, and that the wedding was still being planned, despite the account freeze, and that she had overheard a phone call 2 nights ago in which Tyler had told someone that the Navigator was registered under a company name now, and that he was working on transferring it again before the investigation closed in. She said she was telling me because she thought I deserved to know, and because she hoped that knowing this would allow me to help her separately from Tyler, since she had never been involved in any of what he had done. That last paragraph told me everything I needed to know about why she was actually writing. I went inside and poured a second cup of coffee. Leo was still asleep. It was summer and I had stopped waking him at any particular hour since school was out. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a bird working on something in the oak tree outside the kitchen window. I sat at the kitchen table and read Chloe's email a third time. She was not writing out of conscience. She was writing out of calculation. There is a difference, and by the time a man reaches 65, he has usually learned to tell the two apart. A person acting from conscience leads with what they did wrong. A person acting from calculation leads with what someone else did wrong. Chloe's email had 4 paragraphs about Tyler and 1 sentence, that last one, about herself. I thought about what Logan had told me the previous week when we reviewed the final trust documentation together. He had said that in his experience, families in situations like ours had a tendency to turn on each other once the financial pressure became severe enough. He hadn't said it as a warning exactly, more as an observation. The way a carpenter notes that certain woods split along predictable lines when the grain is under stress. I picked up my phone and forwarded Chloe's email to Tyler. No message, no explanation, just the forward with her original words intact. Then I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and finished my coffee. I was not trying to start a fire between them. I want to be clear about that. I forwarded the email because I had spent 21 days in a hospital bed learning what it felt like to be left without information I deserved to have. I had made a decision somewhere in those 3 weeks that I would not become the kind of man who withheld things strategically. If Chloe's words were going to exist in the world, Tyler was entitled to know they existed. What either of them did with that was no longer my concern. Logan called at 9:15 to check in on the trust paperwork timeline. I mentioned the email. He was quiet for a moment, then said he would note it in the file in case it became relevant later. I appreciated that he didn't offer an opinion on whether I had done the right thing. Some decisions don't need a verdict. They just need to be made cleanly and then left alone. Leo came downstairs at 9:45, still in his pajamas, carrying the sketchbook he had been filling since June. He had drawn something new on the front cover, a small house with a tree beside it, and two figures sitting on the front steps. I recognized the proportions. The taller one had a coffee mug. "Is that supposed to be us?" I asked. He looked at the cover for a moment, then at me. "Maybe," he said. I told him there was cereal in the cabinet and orange juice in the refrigerator, and that if he wanted after breakfast, we could go check on the tomato plant together. He said he wanted to. We went outside after he ate, and I showed him how to trim back the wild branches so the plant could put its energy into the fruit instead of the sprawl. He was careful about it, asking before he cut anything, making sure he understood which branches were helping and which ones were pulling resources away from the rest. It occurred to me standing there in the garden with this 10-year-old boy who asked before he cut that some lessons don't need to be spoken to be understood. My phone buzzed twice on the porch table while we worked. I didn't check it until we were done. Logan called at 6:18 in the evening while I was standing at the stove watching a pot of water come to a boil. Leo had requested pasta for dinner, the simple kind with butter and a little salt, the way I had made it once in early June when we were both too tired to think about anything more complicated. He had asked for it 3 times since then. I had learned in the months since Leo came to live with me that children remember the meals that feel safe, not the elaborate ones. The quiet ones made without fuss, eaten at a table where nobody is asking anything of them. I answered Logan's call on the second ring. He told me that he had received some information through the fraud investigation process, specifically that Tyler had entered into a private lending agreement 4 days ago. The lender was a man named Gerald Pitts, who operated a small private lending firm out of a commercial space on Dunmore Avenue. Gerald Pitts was not a bank. He did not have the patience of a bank, and he did not have the interest rates of a bank either. Logan said the terms of the agreement, which had been signed voluntarily by Tyler, included a repayment schedule with an annual rate of 26%, with the first payment due within 30 days of signing. The amount Tyler had borrowed was $47,000. I stirred the pasta when it went in and didn't say anything for a moment. Logan continued. The money had gone directly to Whitmore Estate as a deposit on the wedding venue, a Saturday booking in mid-October, which was about 10 weeks away. The remaining $3,000 had apparently been used for other deposits. Tyler had told the venue coordinator, according to a source Logan would not identify, that his father was covering the remaining costs. I set the wooden spoon on the rest beside the stove. "He used my name," I said. "He implied your involvement," Logan said carefully. "He didn't sign anything on your behalf this time. But yes, he used your name." I thanked Logan for letting me know. He said he would be in touch early the following week about the trust signing, which was scheduled for Wednesday morning. We confirmed the time, and I hung up. Leo appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a library book about deep-sea fish. He had checked it out 2 weeks ago and renewed it once already. He was the kind of kid who read the same book multiple times, not because he forgot what was in it, but because he liked returning to things he trusted. "Is the pasta ready?" he asked. 2 more minutes, I said. "Go set the table." He disappeared back toward the dining room, and I heard the familiar sounds of him pulling out the drawer for forks, opening the cabinet for glasses. The small domestic choreography that had become, over these past few months, one of the most ordinary and necessary sounds in my life. I thought about Tyler while I drained the pasta. $47,000 borrowed at 26% from a private lender paid directly to a wedding venue 10 weeks away. I ran the numbers the way a man who has run a small business for 30 years runs numbers automatically without drama. Tyler's first payment to Gerald Pitts would be due before the wedding even happened. The interest alone in the first month would be over $1,000. If Tyler had no accessible bank accounts and no legitimate income that I was aware of, I did not see a clear path by which he intended to make that payment. I had not made that path unclear on purpose. I want to be honest about that. I had taken the steps I took, revoking the power of attorney, working with Logan and Robert to address the fraudulent transfer, establishing the trust, because those were the appropriate and necessary responses to what Tyler had done. The consequences that followed from those steps were Tyler's to manage. I had not engineered his difficulty. I had simply stopped absorbing it. Evelyn used to say when the boys at the shop would make careless mistakes and then look to me to fix them, that cleaning up after someone too quickly teaches them nothing except that someone will always come. She had a way of saying things like that plain, without sharpness, just the truth sitting there in the room with you. I had not always listened as carefully as I should have. I was listening now. Leo had set the table, with the placemats slightly uneven, the way he always did, and had put a glass of water on my side, without being asked. He was already in his chair when I brought the bowl of pasta in, and he looked up from his book with the particular expression children have when they are trying to look patient and not quite managing it. "It smells good," he said. "It's just butter and salt," I said. "I know," he said. "That's why it smells good." I sat down across from him and served us both, and we ate the way we had been eating most evenings without much conversation. At first, just the comfortable quiet of two people who had gotten used to sharing a table. Outside the window, the light was going amber, the long kind of summer evening light that made everything look slightly more patient than it was. After a while, Leo asked if the phone call had been about something bad. I considered how to answer that for a moment. "It was about someone making a choice," I said, "and having to live with it." Leo nodded slowly, with the particular gravity that 10-year-olds sometimes produce when they are processing something larger than they have words for. Then he reached for more pasta and asked if we had any of the good bread left. We didn't. But I told him we could pick some up tomorrow. He seemed satisfied with that. And for the evening, so was I. Before I reveal the full plan to expose and bring down my ungrateful children right at their lavish wedding reception, drop the number 100 in the comments below so I know you're still here riding this out with me. Also, please note the next part of this story contains some fictionalized elements added for entertainment and dramatic effect. If this doesn't sit right with you or you'd rather not listen, feel free to turn off the video right here. The first snow of the season came overnight. I noticed it when I went to the kitchen at 5:45 to start the coffee, a thin layer of white across the back garden, soft and even, the kind that arrives without announcement and changes the quality of the light before you have fully processed what you are seeing. The tomato plant was still there at the far end of the yard, its stakes visible above the snow, the last of the season's fruit long since picked and eaten. It looked smaller than it had in summer. Most things do once the season turns. I stood at the kitchen window with my hands wrapped around my coffee mug and watched the light change. It was a Saturday, the 18th of October. Tyler's wedding was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at Whitmore Estate, which was 23 miles from this house. I had looked it up once, not out of any intention to attend, but because knowing the distance felt important in the way that knowing facts often does when everything else feels uncertain. 23 miles, in good traffic about 35 minutes, in October weather longer. I was not going. Logan had confirmed everything on Wednesday morning when we met at his office to complete the trust signing. The documents were thorough, 12 pages of carefully drafted language that established Leo's trust, named Logan as trustee until Leo turned 18 and formally removed Tyler and Chloe from any inheritance claim. Logan had walked me through each section with the patience he always brought to difficult conversations, pausing when I had questions, not rushing past anything. I had signed on 7 separate pages. Logan had the documents notarized and filed before noon. Afterward, we had discussed the arrangement for today. Logan would join the wedding reception by video call at 5:15 after the ceremony, during what was typically the cocktail hour when guests were still gathered and the room was full. He would introduce himself as Jack's attorney and inform Tyler in front of whoever was present of the trust's existence and its terms. He would do this calmly and professionally. He would not raise his voice. He would not editorialize. He would simply read the relevant sections and answer any questions Tyler had about what the document meant. Logan had contacted the Whitmore estate coordinator earlier in the week, introducing himself as the attorney representing the primary financial guarantor of the event. He had explained truthfully that there was a legal matter concerning the financing of the booking that needed to be communicated to the client directly. The coordinator, whose contract with Tyler had been signed under circumstances that now included an outstanding payment concern, had agreed to facilitate the call during the cocktail hour. It was not a deception. It was simply the truth arranged at the right moment. I had asked Logan whether this was the right way to handle it. He had thought about it for a moment, then said that Tyler had chosen to use my name at that venue to imply my financial support to a room full of people who had never verified whether that was true. What Logan was proposing was simply to let the room hear the truth at the same time Tyler did. There was a symmetry to it that I found I could not argue against. I refilled my coffee and went to check on Leo. He was already awake, which surprised me. He was sitting cross-legged on his bed with the sketchbook open in his lap, drawing something with the focused expression he got when an idea had come to him before he was fully prepared for it. I knocked on the door frame, and he looked up. "You're up early," I said. "I had a dream about the garden," he said. "I wanted to draw it before I forgot." I told him breakfast would be ready in 20 minutes, and he nodded without looking up again, already back inside whatever he was working on. I made eggs and toast. Simple things. Evelyn had believed firmly in simple breakfasts on complicated days. Her theory was that if the morning was going to ask a great deal of you, there was no point in making the kitchen ask it too. I had adopted the principle without meaning to, the way you absorb the logic of someone you loved without ever formally deciding to. Logan called at 8:30 to confirm the video call setup was working on his end. He had tested the connection twice already. His assistant had confirmed the Whitmore Estates event schedule cocktail hour ran from 5 to 6, which gave him a workable window. I asked if there was anything I needed to do on my side. He said no. He said my part was already done. Everything I had needed to do had been done over the past 7 months, one careful step at a time. I thanked him and hung up. Leo appeared in the kitchen at 9, sketchbook still in hand, and climbed into his chair at the table. I set a plate of eggs in front of him, and he looked at it with the serious expression of someone who has made a recent decision about eggs. "I think I like them better scrambled than fried," he said. "That's good information," I said. "I'll remember that." He ate with the methodical focus he brought to most things, occasionally glancing out the window at the snow in the garden. I ate across from him and read the first few pages of a woodworking catalog that had arrived in yesterday's mail, though I was not really reading it. At some point he asked, without looking up from his plate, whether today was an important day. I set the catalog down. "It is," I said. "Are you nervous?" he asked. I considered the question honestly, the way he deserved. "No," I said. "I think I stopped being nervous about this a while ago." He looked up at me then with those steady eyes that had always seemed to understand more than a 10-year-old had any particular right to understand. "Good," he said, and went back to his eggs. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and patient the way the best things usually are. At 5:14 in the afternoon, I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was the one Evelyn had picked out the first year we lived in this house, a plain white face with black numbers, nothing decorative about it. Just a clock that told you what time it was without asking anything in return. I had never replaced it. In 31 years, it had needed one new battery. I knew that in 60 seconds, Logan was going to make a call. Leo was on the living room floor with his Lego set, a lighthouse kit he had been working on for 3 days, methodical and patient, in a way that still caught me off guard, sometimes the way good things in unexpected places always do. He had the instruction booklet open beside him and was cross-referencing it before placing each piece, which was more discipline than I had managed at 10, or frankly at most ages since. I stayed in the kitchen. I poured a glass of water I didn't particularly need and stood near the window where I could see the back garden. The snow from the morning had softened through the afternoon, the edges of it gone blurry, where the temperature had edged just above freezing. The tomato stakes were still visible. Bare now, nothing left to support. But still standing. 5:15 came and went without any sound from my phone. That was expected. Logan was not going to call me during. He was going to call me after. I washed the breakfast dishes that I had left in the rack to dry and put them away one at a time. I wiped down the counter. I checked the back door to make sure it was latched against the wind. I did the small maintenance of a house that has learned to take care of itself, and I let the minutes move at their own pace. Leo called from the living room at 5:31 to tell me that the lighthouse was almost done, but that he was missing one of the pieces for the top, and could I come look? I went and looked. The piece was not missing, it had slid under the edge of the couch. I retrieved it and handed it to him, and he accepted it with the gravity of someone receiving something important, which I suppose he was. My phone rang at 5:47. It was Logan. I answered immediately and walked back toward the kitchen, closing the door softly behind me so Leo wouldn't hear. Logan's voice was composed the way it always was, but there was something underneath the composure. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the particular steadiness of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. He told me he had connected to the Whitmore Estates event coordinator at 5:15, who had brought the device into the main reception hall during the cocktail hour as they had arranged. There were approximately 80 guests present as well as the venue staff. Tyler and Victoria were standing near the head table. Thomas, Victoria's father, was nearby. Logan had introduced himself clearly. His name, his role as Jack Calloway's attorney, and the purpose of the call. He had then read the relevant sections of the trust document. The portions establishing Leo as sole beneficiary. The portions formally removing Tyler and Chloe from any claim to the estate, including the woodworking business, the property, and the investment accounts. The portions specifying that the trust was irrevocable and had been executed and notarized the previous Wednesday. He read it the way he did everything steadily, without emphasis, letting the words do their own work. I asked how Tyler had responded. Logan paused for a moment before answering. He said that Tyler had not responded immediately, that there had been a period of silence in the room that lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. That Victoria had looked at Tyler with an expression Logan described as careful and assessing. That Thomas had set down his glass. Then Tyler had said in a voice that Logan described as loud enough for the room to hear that the document had to be fraudulent. That Jack was confused. That Leo was not a real heir because the adoption was not finalized. Logan had anticipated this. He had prepared for it. He told Tyler still calmly, still professionally, that the adoption proceeding was a matter of public court record and had been granted provisional status in June with full finalization expected before the end of the year. He clarified that under Ohio trust law, a provisional adoptee could be named as a trust beneficiary at the grantor's discretion. He offered to answer any further legal questions Tyler had in writing through proper channels. Then he had ended the call. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone and not saying anything for a moment. "Jack," Logan said, "are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "It's done," he said. "Everything you put in place held exactly the way it was supposed to." I thanked him. He said he would send a full written summary by Monday, and that I should call him if anything came up over the weekend. I told him I would. We said goodnight. I stood in the kitchen for another minute after the call ended. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was flattening against the snow, turning the garden a pale and quiet gray. The tomato stakes stood in the cold like they always had, upright, patient, still doing the job they were put there to do even after the season was over. Leo knocked on the kitchen door. "Grandpa Jack," he said through the door, "the lighthouse is finished." I put the phone in my pocket. "I'll be right there," I said. My phone rang at 6:03. I was sitting on the living room floor beside Leo looking at the finished lighthouse. He had placed it on the coffee table and turned on the small LED light that came with the kit and it was casting a warm circle of yellow across the table's surface. We had been sitting there quietly for a while, not really talking, just looking at the thing he had built. It was a good lighthouse, solid, every piece where it was supposed to be. The name on the screen was Tyler. I had unblocked his number 2 days before, on Logan's advice. Logan had said that if Tyler attempted contact after the trust announcement, it would be useful to have a record of it. I had understood the reasoning, without needing it explained further. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I answered. "Tyler," I said. What came back was not a conversation. It was a torrent, words arriving faster than they could be organized. Tyler's voice cracked at the edges, in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager, and had broken the back window of the truck, and thought I was going to send him away for it. He said the trust was a mistake. He said Leo was nobody. He said I had lost my mind, that I was being manipulated by Logan, that the adoption wasn't real, that a 10-year-old boy had no business inheriting anything that Tyler had spent his whole life waiting for. I let him go until he ran out of the first wave of words. It took about 2 minutes. Then I said his name again quietly. "Tyler." He stopped. "I want to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to actually hear it." He didn't respond, but he didn't hang up either. "I spent 21 days in a hospital bed," I said. 21 days with machines keeping me going and a telephone that could receive calls. One asking for the code to my safe. One asking about a hunting jacket. I don't remember the other two, which tells you something about what they contained. The line was quiet. Arthur Mead sat beside me for 17 of those 21 days, I continued. A man I had known for 40 years, who drove himself to that hospital every morning, even though his own heart was giving him trouble he hadn't told me about yet. And Leo, a 10-year-old boy who had no obligation to me at all, sat in that waiting room and drew pictures and brought me things from the vending machine because Arthur thought it would make me smile. Which it did. I paused. Outside, the night had come fully in, and the kitchen light made a yellow rectangle on the back garden snow. "I am not confused," I said. "I am not being manipulated. I made a decision based on what I witnessed with complete clarity during the worst 3 weeks of my life. You were absent. Leo was present. It is not more complicated than that." Tyler's voice came back then lower than before, and something in it had shifted, the anger still there, but with something else underneath it, now something that sounded like the first edge of understanding, or maybe just fear. He said that I was his father, that you didn't do this to your own son. "I know I'm your father," I said. "I have known that for 32 years. I worked my hands to the bone for 32 years because of it. What I am asking you to understand is that being someone's father does not mean you absorb everything they take from you without limit. I have limits, Tyler." It turned out I did. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Victoria's father is standing right here. He's looking at me right now." I understood what that meant. I understood that the room was still full, that Thomas was still present, that the evening had not yet finished unraveling. "Then let him look," I said. "You built this situation one choice at a time. I didn't build it for you." Another silence. Then Tyler said in a voice that had gone flat, in the particular way voices go flat, when something has finally run out. "You're really not going to fix this." "No," I said. "I'm not." I heard something in the background, a chair moving, or a glass being set down too hard, or both. I heard the distant sound of voices that were not Tyler's. Then Tyler's voice came back one more time, quieter than it had been for the entire call. "I needed you," he said. It was the truest thing he had said all evening, possibly in a long time. And because it was true, I let it sit in the air between us for a moment before I answered. "I know," I said. "I needed you too, in March, for 21 days, and you weren't there." The line went quiet. I did not fill the silence. I had learned over the past 7 months that some silences are not yours to fill. After a while, I heard the call disconnect. I set the phone on the table beside the lighthouse. Leo was looking at me with those steady eyes of his, not asking anything, just present the way he always was, the way I had come to understand he had always been, since the first morning in that hospital room, when he had handed me a granola bar from the vending machine and said nothing except that Arthur had told him I probably hadn't eaten. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment, at the lighthouse glowing between us. "It will be," I said, and I meant it. The group chat had been quiet since morning. I had checked it once after breakfast out of habit more than expectation, and found nothing new since the previous week's messages, a cousin asking about a family reunion that was no longer relevant, an aunt's photograph of her garden that nobody had responded to, the usual archaeology of a family group chat that had seen too much all at once and retreated into silence. At 6:41 it woke up. The first message was from a cousin named Dale, who I knew only vaguely. Middle son of my mother's sister, lived somewhere outside Columbus. He wrote, "Is anyone else seeing what's happening at Tyler's wedding right now?" Then 4 seconds later, a second message from the same cousin. Someone just walked in and interrupted the whole reception. I set down my fork. Leo looked up from his plate. "What is it?" "Group chat," I said. "Finish your dinner." He looked at me for a moment, with those steady eyes, then went back to his pasta. I watched the messages come in. Another cousin, Renee, who I knew better, who had called me twice during my hospital stay, just to check in, wrote that her daughter was at the wedding as a guest and had just sent her a voice message. According to Renee's daughter, a man in a dark jacket had arrived at the reception hall at approximately 6:30 and asked to speak with Tyler Calloway. The venue coordinator had tried to redirect him. He had not been redirected. He had waited near the entrance in a way that the venue coordinator apparently found difficult to argue with. And when Tyler came through the hallway, the man had approached him directly. I knew without being told who the man in the dark jacket was. Gerald Pitts, according to Logan's description, was not a loud man. He was the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to communicate urgency. The first payment on Tyler's $47,000 loan had been due in 30 days from signing. Tyler had signed 4 weeks ago. The wedding was today. Gerald Pitts had done the arithmetic. The messages in the group chat continued arriving, each one adding a piece to what was happening 23 miles away. The venue coordinator had called for assistance. 2 officers had arrived within 15 minutes, not because anyone had done anything that required immediate intervention, but because Whitmore Estate had a standing arrangement with the county for event security, and a disruption during a reception was enough to trigger a request. Logan called at 7:19. He told me that his contact at the venue had given him a brief account of the evening. Gerald Pitts had spoken to Tyler privately near the hallway entrance, away from the main reception floor. The conversation had lasted approximately 8 minutes. After it concluded, Tyler had returned to the reception, looking in Logan's contact's words like a man who had just been reminded of something he had been hoping to forget. The officers had spoken with Tyler briefly before leaving. Logan said they had informed Tyler that he was required to contact the County Fraud Investigation Unit the following Monday to discuss a matter related to a vehicle transfer, the forged power of attorney, that Logan had filed with the investigating officer months earlier. The case had been moving through the system at the pace these things moved. The timing, Logan said, was not something he had engineered. It was simply the pace of the process arriving at today of its own accord. I thanked Logan. He said goodnight a second time and hung up. I set the phone down and looked at my dinner, which had gone cold. Leo had finished his and was watching me with the particular patience he had, not pressing, not asking, just present. I appreciated it more than I knew how to say. "Do you want me to heat yours up?" he asked. "No," I said, "it's fine cold." He accepted this without argument, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate most about him. He did not push. He offered, and then he let you decide, and then he moved on. It was a quality that some adults spent decades trying to learn and never quite managed. I ate the rest of my dinner cold, and thought about Tyler standing in that hallway at Whitmore Estate, the venue he had borrowed $47,000 to book in the name of a wedding that was now surrounded by the accumulated weight of every decision he had made since March. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I want to be clear about it, because the feeling I had was more complicated and quieter than satisfaction. It was something closer to the feeling you get when a long winter finally shows the first sign of turning. Not joy exactly, just the acknowledgement that the season had run its course. After dinner, Leo helped me clear the table, which he had started doing without being asked sometime in September. He carried his plate and glass to the sink and rinsed them the way I had shown him, then dried his hands on the dish towel and folded it back over the oven handle instead of leaving it on the counter. "Grandpa Jack," he said, not turning around. "Yes," I said. "Is the person who needed to hear something, did they hear it?" I considered the question the way it deserved. "I think they heard some of it," I said. "The rest takes time." He nodded, still not turning around, looking out the small window above the sink at the dark garden and the snow that the porch light caught at the edges. "Okay," he said. "That's probably enough for one day." I thought he was probably right about that. By 8 o'clock, the house had settled into the quiet that comes after a long day. Leo was on the couch with his library book about deep-sea fish, the one he had renewed twice now, and still wasn't finished with. I was in the armchair across from him, with a woodworking catalog I had been meaning to read for 2 weeks, and for a while the only sounds were the occasional turn of a page and the low hum of the heating system coming on for the first time this season. The lighthouse Leo had built sat on the coffee table between us, its small LED still casting that warm circle of yellow across the surface. The group chat had been quiet for over an hour. I had stopped checking it after Logan's call. There was a limit, I had decided, to how much information a person needed to receive in a single evening, and I had reached mine sometime around 7:30. Whatever was still unfolding at Whitmore Estate was unfolding without my participation, which was exactly as it should be. Then Cousin Renee sent a message at 8:14. She wrote carefully the way she always did, complete sentences, no abbreviations. The kind of message that signals the person writing it understands the weight of what they are passing along. She wrote that her daughter had called from the parking lot of Whitmore Estate and that the reception had ended earlier than scheduled. She wrote that Victoria had spoken privately with Tyler after Gerald Pitts left the building and that the conversation had not gone the way Tyler had hoped. She wrote that Victoria's father, Thomas, had been seen leaving with his daughter shortly after 8 o'clock, and that the ring Victoria had been wearing when she arrived was not on her finger when she left. I read the message twice. Then I set the catalog down on the side table. Leo glanced up from his book. I must have made some small movement that caught his attention because he looked at me with a question already forming on his face. I shook my head slightly, and he went back to his book. He had learned over these months to read the difference between news that required discussion and news that required only acknowledgement. I thought about Victoria for a moment. Not with any particular feeling about her. I had never met her, had seen her name only in Tyler's messages and Logan's reports. But I thought about what it meant to be a 28-year-old woman who had arrived at a wedding reception and left without the ring she had come in with, and I found I could not reduce that to a simple judgment. People make decisions based on what they know at the time. When the information changes, sometimes the decision changes with it. That is not always a failure of character. Sometimes it is just honesty arriving late. My phone lit up at 8:37. The number was not one I recognized. I answered because Logan had advised me to document any contact from unknown numbers over the weekend. It was Chloe. She was using someone else's phone. I understood this immediately from the unfamiliar number. Her voice was controlled in the specific way that voices are controlled when the person speaking them is working very hard not to let something else come through. She said she was at the venue. She said her card had been declined when she tried to arrange her own transportation home. She said she was asking not for anything related to Tyler, just for help getting back to her apartment. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Chloe, I heard you. I'm not going to help tonight." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad." It was the first time in a long time she had called me that, without a request attached to it. I noticed it. I let myself notice it. "I know," I said. "Call someone who can actually be there with you. That's the honest answer I can give you right now." She didn't respond. After a few seconds, the call ended. I looked at the unknown number on the screen for a moment, then blocked it. Not with anger, with the same careful deliberateness I had applied to every decision over the past 7 months. A boundary is not a wall built in rage. It is a line drawn clearly after long consideration that says this is where I end and where the damage has to stop. Leo had put his book down and was looking at the lighthouse. "Is it over?" he asked. I thought about the question properly before I answered it. "The loud part is," I said. He considered this. "What comes after the loud part?" "The part where everyone figures out what comes next," I said. "That part takes longer, but it's quieter." He seemed to find this acceptable. He picked his book back up and found his page again with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned not to lose his place. I sat for a while longer in the armchair, not reading, just sitting. The heating system ran its cycle and went quiet. The lighthouse glowed steadily on the table between us. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the oak tree in the yard, the same tree the bird had been working on that morning, though the bird was long gone now, somewhere warmer. I thought about Evelyn. I thought about what she would have said about this evening, about all of it. The months of careful steps, the documents and the phone calls and the trust, and the $5, and the 21 days that had started everything. She would have had something plain and true to say about it, the way she always did. She would have said it once and it would have been enough. I picked up the catalog again. I didn't read it, but I held it, and that was something. At 9:45, I told Leo it was time for bed. He closed his book, said goodnight, with the particular formality he sometimes used when he was tired, and being careful about it, and went upstairs. I heard the water run, the familiar sound of him moving through the routine of the evening. I turned off the lights downstairs one by one, leaving the kitchen light on the way I always did. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the dark garden through the window, the snow still pale at the edges, where the porch light reached it. Then I went upstairs. The loud part was over. I was up before the sun on Sunday morning. This was not unusual. I had been waking before 5 for most of my adult life, a habit from the years when the workshop needed to be open by 7, and there was always something that needed doing before the first customer arrived. The body keeps its schedules long after the reasons for them have changed. I had learned to stop arguing with mine. I made coffee and carried it to the front porch. The night had taken most of the snow. What remained was in the places the sun never quite reached, along the base of the fence, under the oak tree, in the narrow strip of shadow beside the garage. The rest of the yard had gone back to the brown and gray of late October, the grass flattened and damp, the garden beds empty. It looked like a yard that had been through something and was resting now. I sat in the wooden chair I kept on the porch, the one I had built myself. 20 years ago, from a piece of white oak I had been saving since before Tyler was born. Evelyn had said when I finished it that it looked like a chair that intended to last, and she had been right. It had lasted through everything. I sat there in the cold with my coffee, and I thought about 7 months. 7 months ago, I had been in a hospital bed, not entirely certain from one day to the next which direction things were going to go. The machines had done their steady, patient work. Arthur had done his. Leo had done his in the particular way a 10-year-old does things, without calculation, without agenda, just showing up, because Arthur had told him it was the right thing to do, and he had believed it. I thought about the 4 messages Tyler had sent in those 21 days. I had memorized them without meaning to. The safe code request, the hunting jacket. The other two which I still could not fully reconstruct, because they had contained so little that my mind had not found anything worth holding on to. 4 messages in 21 days from a son I had spent 32 years building a life to support. I had run the numbers more than once the way a man who has spent his life measuring and cutting does. 4 messages divided by 21 days is less than 1 message every 5 days. Less than 1. And I had sent him $5. I had thought about that transaction many times since June, and each time I came back to the same understanding. The $5 was not a punishment. It was not a joke. It was the only honest answer I had to give to a request that had no honest answer. Tyler had asked me for $50,000 for a wedding, while I was still making sense of the months I had just come through. The $5 was what I had to offer to that particular ask from that particular person in that particular moment. Nothing more and nothing less. Arthur had said something to me once in those last weeks before his heart gave out that I had been turning over in my mind ever since. He had said it quietly, the way he said most things on an afternoon when we were sitting in the garden and Leo was inside doing something with the library books he was always cycling through. He had said, "The ones who stay are the ones who matter." It sounds simple because it is simple. The hard part is letting yourself believe it. I had been letting myself believe it slowly for 7 months. Leo appeared in the doorway at 6:47, wearing his pajamas and the thick socks he had started keeping by the front door since the weather changed. He had his sketchbook under one arm and a second mug in his hand. He had poured himself the remaining coffee from the pot, which he was not technically supposed to have but which I had stopped addressing because the amount he took was never enough to matter, and the gesture of it meant something I didn't have words for. He sat on the porch step below my chair without asking the way he always did and opened the sketchbook to a fresh page. We sat like that for a while without talking. The sun came up gradually, the way it does in October, not a sudden brightness but a slow shift in the quality of the gray, the world becoming more detailed by degrees. The oak tree, the fence line, the tomato stakes at the far end of the garden, bare and patient as they had been all season. "What are you thinking about?" Leo asked, not looking up from his sketchbook. 7 months, I said. He drew something I could see his hand moving, but not what he was making. "Is that a long time?" he asked. I considered the question the way it deserved. "It's long enough," I said. "Long enough for things to show you what they are." He nodded slowly the way he did when he was filing something away. I thought about the $5 again. About the moment I had typed the memo, "Good luck, son," and pressed confirm, and set the phone down on the kitchen table. I had not felt powerful in that moment. I had not felt righteous. I had felt more than anything tired. Tired in the deep way you feel tired when you have been carrying something for a very long time and have finally carefully set it down in the right place. "Grandpa Jack," Leo said. "Yes," I said. He turned the sketchbook around and held it up so I could see. He had drawn the porch, the oak tree, 2 figures, one in a chair, one on the step below. The taller one had a coffee mug. The smaller one had a sketchbook. In the corner of the page, in the careful block letters he used when he wanted something to be legible, he had written 4 words. "This is our home." I looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then I looked at him, this 10-year-old boy who had handed me a granola bar in a hospital waiting room 7 months ago because Arthur had said it might help, and who had stayed and who was still here drawing our porch in the early morning light of a Sunday in October. "Yes," I said, "it is." The sun kept coming up. The yard kept drying out. And the 2 of us sat on that porch and let the morning do what mornings do: arrive, settle, and make the next thing possible. Weeks passed, the way weeks do after something large has finished. Not quickly, but steadily, each one a little quieter than the one before. November came in cold and gray, the kind of Ohio November that doesn't apologize for itself. The leaves came down all at once in the first week, and Leo and I spent a Saturday afternoon raking them into piles along the fence line, which Leo then walked through deliberately, which undid most of the work which neither of us minded particularly. We raked them again. He walked through them again. By the time we were done, it was almost dark, and we were both cold, and the yard looked roughly the same as when we started, but we had been outside for 3 hours, and something about that felt right. Logan called in the second week of November with an update on the fraud investigation. Tyler had retained an attorney and agreed to cooperate with the county investigator's inquiry into the forged power of attorney. Logan explained this to me carefully, the way he explained everything clearly without editorializing. Cooperation in cases like this typically resulted in reduced exposure, he said. The process would take months. There would be conditions attached to whatever resolution the investigation reached. It was not a clean ending, but it was a real one, and real ones rarely came clean. I thanked him. I asked about the adoption timeline. Logan said the finalization hearing was scheduled for the 14th of December. He said it was a formality. At this point, the provisional status had held through the entire process without challenge, and the court's review had been straightforward. He said I should bring Leo if I wanted to, that it was the kind of thing a person might want to be present for. I said we would both be there. I told Leo about it that evening over dinner. I explained what the hearing meant, that after December 14th, the paperwork would reflect what had already been true for months, which was that he lived here, that this was his home, that I was responsible for him and intended to remain so. He listened with the serious attention he brought to things that mattered, and when I finished, he asked if he needed to wear a tie. I told him a tie was optional but would not go unappreciated. He said he would think about it. He wore the tie. The hearing on the 14th lasted 22 minutes. The judge was a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had the particular manner of someone who has presided over enough difficult situations to recognize a straightforward one when it arrives. She reviewed the documentation Logan had prepared, asked Leo 2 questions directly: whether he understood where he lived and whether he was comfortable there, and accepted his answers with a nod that suggested she had seen enough to know when a child meant what he said. She signed the finalization order at 11:47 in the morning. In the parking lot afterward, Leo reached up and straightened his tie, which had gone slightly crooked during the hearing. "Is it done?" he asked. "It's done," I said. He nodded once with the gravity he always brought to conclusions. Then he asked if we could get lunch somewhere with good soup because it was cold, and he had been thinking about soup since breakfast. We found a diner 3 blocks from the courthouse that had been there since before I was born. We ordered soup. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window and watched the December street outside and ate our lunch without any particular hurry. I thought about Chloe once during that lunch briefly. Logan had mentioned in passing a few weeks earlier that she had found work a position at an accounting firm in Columbus entry-level, the kind of start that required more from a person than it gave back, at least at the beginning. I did not know more than that. I had not sought more than that. But I had noted it the way you note something that tells you a door has not closed entirely, even if it is not open yet either. Tyler, I thought about less. Not from indifference, but because there was less to think about. The investigation was ongoing. His life was being sorted out by processes that did not require my participation. I had done what I needed to do, and the rest was his to navigate. Some things you can carry for your children, and some things you cannot. I had spent 32 years not learning the difference clearly enough. I was learning it now. Callaway Woodworks had a good December. 3 custom orders came in: a dining table for a family in Westerville, a set of built-in bookshelves for a house in Bexley, and a blanket chest that a man named Howard wanted finished before Christmas for his wife, who had admired one like it in a magazine for years. I worked on all 3 in sequence, the familiar rhythm of measuring and cutting and fitting, returning to me as naturally as breathing. Leo came to the workshop after school sometimes and sat on the stool in the corner and did his homework, while I worked the sound of the hand plane and the scratch of his pencil, filling the space in a way that felt each time like something I had not known I was missing. On the 23rd of December, I found his boots by the front door when I came in from the workshop. Small boots laced unevenly the way he always did, them toed slightly outward. They had been there every evening for months in that spot by the door, because he had decided in September that boots belonged by the front door and had never varied from this position. I stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at them. Evelyn would have loved him. I was certain of that, in the way I was certain of very few things, without evidence, without reasoning. Just the clean, direct certainty that comes from knowing someone well enough to know what they would have recognized. I hung up my coat. I could hear Leo in the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing, the particular efficient movement of a child who has learned where everything is and moves through a space like he belongs in it. Because he did. Christmas morning was quiet. We opened the things we had gotten each other: a new set of drawing pencils for Leo, a woodworking book he had found at the library sale and set aside for weeks, a scarf he had picked out himself at the hardware store, which was the only shopping he had access to and which I wore without reservation. We made breakfast together, eggs and toast, the simple kind. We sat at the table and ate while the winter light came in through the kitchen window, pale and clean. At some point, Leo looked up from his plate and said in the matter-of-fact tone he used for observations, he considered obvious, "This is a good Christmas." I looked at him across the table, at the drawing pencils beside his plate, at the scarf around my neck. "Yes," I said, "it is." Outside, the last of December settled over the yard, quiet and cold, and still, the way the end of a hard year sometimes is when it finally decides to let you rest. I picked up my coffee. Leo picked up his orange juice, and the two of us sat together in the good light of a good morning and let the year finish. Looking back at my life, I see a man who confused providing with parenting. Let my experience be your caution. Don't be like me. Do not spend decades blinding yourself to the character of your children just because you share a last name. Blood merely populates a family tree. It does not guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. When I was gasping for air in that ICU ward, my own flesh and blood were merely hunting for safe codes and car titles. It is a bitter truth, but some people only view you as an asset to liquidate. Through this pain, I learned a profound lesson about the ties that truly bind us. God doesn't always deliver your family through a birth canal. Sometimes He places them in an empty hospital room, holding a crayon drawing of a smiling son. These grandpa stories are not just about betrayal, but about rebuilding on solid ground. This family story taught me that true devotion must be earned, not assumed. Leo showed me what real presence means, while Tyler and Chloe showed me the ultimate cost of greed. Every home needs a firm foundation, and I am finally building mine with a boy who actually cares if my heart is beating. These deeply personal grandpa stories remind us to cherish those who show up when the world fades away. I hope this specific family story serves as a wake-up call to fathers everywhere. Protecting your peace is not a sin, it is a necessity. If you found value in these grandpa stories, please comment your thoughts below, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more impactful family story content. Thank you for watching until the very end. A quick disclaimer. This story may contain fictionalized elements constructed purely for educational and dramatic purposes. If this content does not resonate with you, please feel free to explore alternative material that better suits your preferences.